30 days ago, I deleted every social media app from my phone. Not for productivity. Not for some digital detox challenge I saw online. I did it because I noticed something about my own mind that genuinely scared me, and I needed 30 days of silence to find out if it was actually true. I'm going to tell you exactly what I found, including one specific moment, on day 12, that I haven't told anyone until this video. But first, I need you to be honest with yourself about something, because I think most of you already know exactly what I'm about to describe. Here's what I noticed, in the weeks before I deleted anything. I'd open an app without deciding to. Not out of boredom, exactly, more like a reflex, the way your hand moves to scratch an itch before you've consciously registered it. I'd look up 10 minutes later, sometimes 20, with no memory of choosing to spend that time, and no clear sense of what I'd even seen. That wasn't the part that scared me. The part that scared me was what happened in the 30 seconds right after I put the phone down. There was a specific, low mood that settled in almost every single time, not sadness exactly, more like a faint sense of falling behind, of having just witnessed dozens of lives that were somehow further along than mine, better organized, more accomplished, more at peace. And the strange thing was, I couldn't ever point to one specific thing I'd seen that caused it. It wasn't any single post. It was the accumulated residue of dozens of small comparisons, made so quickly and so automatically that I never consciously registered making any of them. I want to be precise about this, because I think we misdiagnose this feeling constantly. It's not really about envy, in the classic sense. I didn't specifically want any one person's specific life. It was something vaguer and, in a way, more corrosive, a general, ambient sense that everyone else's life had a coherent narrative, a clear upward trajectory, while mine felt like unedited footage, messy, uncertain, full of the ordinary confusion that never makes it into anyone's feed. The moment that actually pushed me to delete everything happened on an unremarkable Tuesday evening. I'd had, by any honest measure, a genuinely good day, a productive morning, a decent conversation with a friend, dinner with someone I cared about. And then I spent 40 minutes scrolling before bed, and fell asleep feeling like the day had been somehow insufficient. Not because anything had actually gone wrong. Because 40 minutes of other people's curated highlights had quietly overwritten my own accurate memory of a genuinely fine day, replacing it with a vague, unearned sense of falling short. That's the specific thing that scared me. Not the time wasted is recoverable. What scared me was realizing that an app on my phone had somehow gained the ability to overwrite my own honest assessment of my own day, without my permission, almost without my noticing it happening in real time. I want to sit with that for a second longer, because I think it's the actual core of the whole problem, more than the time spent or the content itself. We tend to think of these platforms as simply a place we visit, a room we walk into and out of, unaffected by the visit once we've left. What I noticed that Tuesday suggested something closer to the opposite. The visit was quietly rewriting the room I actually lived in, the memory of my own day, after the fact, without my consent and without my even noticing the edit had been made until I went looking for the original file and found it altered. That's a strange kind of vulnerability to discover about yourself in your 30s, sitting on the edge of a bed on an ordinary Tuesday. Not that the apps were stealing my time, I already knew that, in a vague way everyone knows it. It was that they'd apparently gained editorial access to my own sense of how my life was actually going, and I had never consciously granted that access. It had just accumulated, scroll by scroll, comparison by comparison, until it was simply how evenings worked. I'll tell you exactly what happened on day 12, the moment I said I hadn't told anyone about, but first I need to walk you through what the first week and a half of silence actually felt like, because it was far worse before it got better, and I think that part matters more than the eventual relief does. The first 3 days were, without exaggeration, some of the most restless days I can remember. My thumb kept finding the empty space on my home screen where an icon used to be, dozens of times a day, an involuntary reflex searching for something that simply wasn't there anymore. I'd feel a specific kind of itch, not urgent, not painful, just a persistent low hum of, check something, with genuinely nothing left to check. By day 5, the itch had mostly faded, but something more uncomfortable replaced it, boredom, real and unstructured, in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I'd finish dinner and simply sit there, with no scroll to fill the gap, confronting an amount of unstructured time I'd apparently been quietly avoiding for a very long time without realizing it. It was almost embarrassing how disorienting ordinary silence had become. Around day 8, a strange thing started happening. I began noticing my own thoughts arriving more slowly, and more completely. I'd start a thought, about a conversation, a decision, a memory, and instead of the thought getting cut off 8 seconds in by the reflex to check something, it would simply continue, all the way to wherever it was actually going. I hadn't realized how rarely I let a single thought run its full course anymore, until I suddenly had dozens of them doing exactly that, every day, uninterrupted. By day 10, I noticed something about sleep. I was falling asleep faster, and waking up with a specific kind of clarity I hadn't had in years, not because anything about my sleep schedule had changed, but because I was no longer closing each day with 40 minutes of other people's curated highlights loaded into the last conscious moments before unconsciousness. Whatever I'd been falling asleep to for years, I was now falling asleep to nothing but my own actual day, replayed honestly, without the added weight of everyone else's edited version of theirs. I also noticed, somewhere around day 9, a specific change in how I handled small moments of waiting, a queue, a red light, a friend running late. Previously, every single one of those gaps had an automatic, near-instant filler. Now they were simply gaps again, the way they'd been before I owned a smartphone at all, and I was surprised by how quickly I remembered how to just stand there, doing nothing, without it feeling unbearable. It took less than 2 weeks to relearn something I would have sworn, a month earlier, I'd completely lost the capacity for. And then came day 12. Before I tell you what happened, I want you to actually answer this in the comments, not just nod and keep scrolling. What's the specific moment, right after you close an app, where you feel that vague, falling behind, feeling the most? Name the app, name the moment. I promise you, reading the replies under a video like this is one of the more validating things you'll do this week, because you'll see exactly how universal this specific, hard-to-name feeling actually is. Day 12 is the part of this story I haven't told anyone, and it's not dramatic in the way you might expect. It's small. But it's the moment that actually explained everything that came before it. On day 12, out of habit, I picked up my phone, unlocked it, and stared at the home screen for a full 3 or 4 seconds before I remembered there was nothing there to check anymore. And in that specific gap, phone in hand, nowhere to direct the reflex, I felt something I genuinely wasn't prepared for, a kind of quiet panic, disproportionate to the situation, the way you might feel patting your pockets for keys that were in your hand the entire time. What unsettled me wasn't the moment itself. It was what I realized immediately afterward, sitting with that small panic. I hadn't been checking those apps because I was curious about anything specific. I'd been checking them the way you check a wound to see if it still hurts, compulsively, almost clinically, needing the confirmation of the ache more than any actual information. Every scroll had been, in some small way, a fresh comparison, and some part of me had apparently been seeking that comparison out deliberately, the way you press on a bruise just to feel it again, even though you already know exactly how much it hurts. That's the part one hadn't told anyone, because it felt like admitting something slightly humiliating, that I hadn't simply been a passive victim of an addictive algorithm. Some part of me had been actively, repeatedly choosing the comparison, day after day, the way you might return to a conversation you know will upset you, because some part of the upset itself had become oddly familiar, almost comfortable in its predictability. Once I saw that clearly, the rest of the 30 days looked different. This wasn't really a story about apps being designed to be addictive, even though they obviously are. It was a story about what happens when you finally notice you've been quietly volunteering for something you always assumed was being done to you. I spent the rest of that evening, after putting the phone down for the second time, trying to trace the feeling back further, to see how long it had actually been running underneath the surface. I couldn't find a clear starting point. It wasn't a single bad experience or a specific traumatic comparison. It was more like sediment, thousands of tiny, forgettable comparisons, each one too small to notice individually, accumulating over years into something that finally had enough weight to notice as a single, coherent thing on one unremarkable Tuesday. That's often how these patterns actually form, I think, despite how badly we want a clean origin story for them. Not one dramatic moment. Thousands of forgettable ones, quietly adding up until the total finally crosses some threshold where you can no longer ignore it. I want to bring in someone else's experience here, because mine alone might sound like an isolated, slightly neurotic case. A friend of mine, Nadia, did a version of the same thing around the same time, for a completely different reason. She wasn't chasing a feeling, she was recovering from one. She'd gone through a difficult breakup, and found herself checking her ex's social media multiple times a day, each check producing the same small, precise wound, reopened deliberately, day after day. She told me something that reframed my own experience even further. She said the compulsion to check wasn't really about him anymore, 3 months in. It was about the specific, familiar shape of the hurt itself. I think I was addicted to the ache, she said, more than I was still attached to him. She'd built, without realizing it, a small daily ritual around confirming that the wound was still there, the same way you might press a bruise just to make sure it still exists, long after the actual injury has mostly healed. When she finally deleted the apps, her first 2 weeks looked almost identical to mine: restlessness, a phantom reflex reaching for something no longer there, an uncomfortable excess of unstructured time. But by week 3, she told me, something had genuinely shifted. Without the daily ritual of reopening the wound, it had simply started closing on its own, at whatever pace wounds actually close when you stop interfering with them. I didn't get over him by thinking about him less, she said. I got over him by removing my own ability to keep the wound fresh on purpose. I think that's the actual mechanism underneath a huge amount of compulsive scrolling, regardless of what specifically triggers it for any individual person. It's rarely about the content itself. It's about a self-administered, repeatable ritual: comparison, heartbreak, outrage, whatever the specific flavor happens to be for you, that some part of us keeps choosing to reopen, because the ritual itself has become more familiar than its absence. Nadia told me one more thing, months later, that I think about often. She said the hardest part wasn't the first 2 weeks, which she'd expected to be difficult. It was a specific moment around week 6, well after the acute craving had faded, when she found herself wanting to check again, not out of genuine curiosity about her ex's life, but out of something closer to nostalgia for the ritual itself, the way you might miss a difficult period of your life not because it was good, but because it was familiar. And familiarity carries its own gravitational pull regardless of whether the thing you're familiar with was actually good for you. She resisted that particular pull, she said, by naming it precisely in the moment, not, I want to check on him, but, I miss the ritual of checking, which she found was a much easier urge to sit with and let pass than the first framing would have been. Renaming the urge accurately, rather than accepting whatever story it first offered about itself, turned out to matter enormously. Now, I know the obvious pushback, and it's completely fair: I actually need social media. I run a small business through it, or I stay in touch with family overseas, or my job genuinely requires it. That's real, and this isn't an argument for permanent, total deletion for everyone. Here's the more useful distinction, though. Notice the difference between using an app for a specific, bounded purpose, posting a product update, messaging a specific relative, checking a specific piece of information, and opening it in the reflexive, undirected way I described at the start, with no destination in mind, purely to fill a gap or scratch an unnamed itch. The 30 days weren't valuable because they removed all contact with these platforms forever. They were valuable because they broke the reflexive, undirected version of the habit long enough for me to see it clearly, for the first time in years, from the outside. You don't necessarily need permanent deletion. You need enough distance, even briefly, to actually notice which version of the habit you're running. There's a simple test that's helped me since, for anyone whose work genuinely requires staying connected. Before opening the app, name the specific task out loud, even just in your head: checking messages from my supplier, posting today's update. If you can name a specific task, you're using the tool deliberately, and that's fine. If you open the app and only afterward try to invent a reason for having done so, that's the reflexive version reasserting itself, dressed up retroactively as purpose. The test isn't whether you have a job that requires the app. It's whether you can catch yourself opening it before you've actually named why. So here's what to actually do with this. First, notice your specific, falling behind, moment, precisely, the way I asked you to name in the comments earlier. You can't interrupt a pattern you haven't actually located. Second, try a real break, not a symbolic one. A single day proves very little, the itch hasn't even peaked yet by then. Somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks is usually where the actual shift happens, the way it did for both Nadia and me around week 2 to 3. Third, pay attention to what fills the gap, not just what you removed. The unstructured time, the completed thoughts, the different quality of sleep, that's the actual content of what you're getting back. If you simply replace scrolling with another form of reflexive distraction, you've moved the habit, not interrupted it. Fourth, watch for your own version of day 12, the moment you catch yourself reaching for the ritual, not the content. That moment, uncomfortable as it is the most useful data point in the entire experiment, because it shows you the actual mechanism rather than the surface behavior. Fifth, when you do return to these platforms, return with a specific, bounded purpose each time, rather than an open-ended scroll. Check the one thing you opened the app to check, and close it. The goal isn't necessarily permanent absence. It's converting a reflexive habit into a deliberate, occasional tool. I'll add a sixth, smaller piece of advice, because it's the one that actually made the following month sustainable rather than a single, dramatic month that quietly reverted once the novelty wore off. Keep a specific, tiny ritual to replace the gap the apps used to fill. Mine became making a coffee slowly, without doing anything else at the same time, during the exact windows I used to fill with a scroll. It sounds almost too small to matter. But an empty gap with nothing assigned to it tends to get reclaimed by whatever reflex is strongest, and for most of us, that reflex still points straight back to the phone unless something else has been deliberately placed there first. So here's what 30 days of silence actually added up to. I didn't become a fundamentally different person. I didn't suddenly become spectacularly productive or transform into someone who reads a book a week. What actually changed was smaller, and more durable than I expected. The specific, automatic comparison reflex I described at the start had genuinely quieted down. Not disappeared entirely, I don't think it fully disappears for anyone living in this era, but it stopped running constantly in the background, the way a noise you've lived with for years fades once it finally stops. When I eventually reinstalled one app, cautiously, on day 31, I noticed the difference immediately. I could feel the reflex trying to reactivate, the urge to scroll without direction, the low hum of comparison waiting to resume. But because I'd spent 30 days without it, I could actually see the reflex arriving in real time, the way you notice a familiar smell precisely because you've been away from it long enough to smell it again as if for the first time. That noticing, more than anything else, has been the lasting change. Not abstinence. Awareness of the mechanism, finally visible after years of running invisibly in the background of every ordinary evening. Nadia's still off the apps that mattered most to her recovery, mostly by choice now rather than necessity. I've let a couple back in, on my own terms, checked with intention instead of reflex. I think the actual lesson here isn't delete everything forever, which is a much bigger claim than 30 days can honestly support. It's smaller and, I think, more useful. Most of us are carrying at least one small, repeatable ritual, a comparison, an ache, an old wound we keep checking on, that we've quietly mistaken for something being done to us, when some part of us has actually been choosing to reopen it, day after day, because the familiar shape of it has become more comfortable than its absence. You don't need 30 days to start noticing yours. You just need one honest moment, phone in hand, asking yourself what you were actually hoping to feel by opening it, and whether that feeling was ever really about the content at all. I think about that Tuesday evening often, the one that started all of this, not because it was dramatic, but because of how ordinary it was. Nothing had gone wrong that day. Nothing needed fixing. The only thing that actually happened was 40 minutes of quiet, automatic comparison, and a good day quietly rewritten into an insufficient one. Most of the damage this particular habit does, I've come to think, isn't loud enough to notice in the moment. It just accumulates, one perfectly ordinary Tuesday at a time, until an entire year's worth of genuinely fine days have been quietly filed away as somehow not quite good enough, not because anything was wrong with them, but because something kept rewriting the file after the fact, and nobody ever asked it to. Before you go, scroll down and tell me, what's your version of day 12? The moment you caught yourself reaching for the ritual, not the content. One sentence. I read every single comment, and I think you'll find a surprising number of strangers describing the exact same moment in their own words. And if this is the video that finally gets you to try your own version of these 30 days, even just for a week, subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of honest, unflinching thing this channel exists to talk about. The reflex is still there, waiting in your pocket right now. The only real question is whether you're finally ready to notice it.